one of the things that's fascinated me is that four very different individuals, for very different presentations in their way, I just kept hearing, oh, that links to that, that connects to that. And so let me sort of set people in this direction for when I open things up to questions and comments from all of you, that I would appreciate it if you could think about topics or issues that really, could be addressed to all four of our guests, rather than, since we've already had, some opportunity to talk to people individually about their own, presentations and projects. I really want to get a discussion going about things that link or share. Not necessarily, that I'm forcing agreement. We might want to wrangle on some things, but at the same time, I want us to be thinking through things that we're all thinking about. And I thought I would begin by reminding you all, maybe it's more than obvious, that one of the goals of this this seminar and our future iterations is to bring, and again, I know the terms are a little fuzzy and shaky, but to bring scholars and artists together in dialogue and in conversation. And I'm going to kind of brag a little bit about comic studies. That comic studies, or the world of comics, I guess I'll say, I think is better at this, maybe because it's younger, or my suspicion is because people begin in fandom on both sides. It's better at doing this than other fields. And I may get in trouble with someone in the room, but I'm grounded in film studies, and film studies is always sort of recognized and to some extent accepted that the filmmakers don't pay much attention at all to what we do as scholars and critics. Every now and then there's some link or overlap, but it's almost two separate worlds. And literature, in a place like Iowa City, there's actually a lot more interaction, but to a certain extent, I don't think there's typically been a presumption if you're a scholar of literature, particularly, of course, if you're dealing with older material, but that you're going to interact with the writers that you study and teach. And comics has allowed a lot more. Every comic scholar I know has met comics artists. And even comics artists sort of put up with the comic scholars, it seems to me, to some extent. So one of the things, sort of one of the opening questions I want to raise is, for all of you, how the scholars and critics, and again, I'm allowing many of us sort of slip and slide in that category, but how you listen to and benefit from descriptions from the perspectives of the artists, I think that's actually going to be probably easy to talk about. But also I want to hear the artists talk about how they hear the critics. And I'll give you just one convenient example. Ever since Frederick introduced the term, I've been thinking about ethno-racial pause. So here's a critical term, a critical concept. It's in response to comics, obviously. The comics, Frederick is positing, and I'm convinced, are doing this. But here's a explanatory way to talk about it. And so something like that. So for Bishakh and for Stacey, or the notion of the geometrical splash page. My sense is both of you have done that, but likely not with that term. And so, the critical term kind of gives us a way of thinking about it. So I'm trying to think through, and now I want your help, thinking through that sort of movement. So the critic is responding to work comics do and posits a category or a term, but then now artists might think of what they do with that term or category. Does this make sense? That sort of movement. So whether you want to talk about those, these came up yesterday and they're useful, but other things too. I'm thinking Rebecca's discussion of the interaction between comics and high art has very much to do with Stacey, I think, your work in collage, for example. So that's what I mean about these sort of links and resonances. And I'll just ask anyone to sort of dive in along those lines.
Can I say something really quick? First of all, I agree about comics, but as a space where we come together. But I also want to emphasize the fact that it doesn't just happen. Like,
Right.
we have to make it happen, and also historically, brown, black, trans, queer, LGBTQ folks having that space of being able to come together and have and generate new knowledge as artists, as conceptual builders, has to be made. And you can't take it for granted. We know that as a fact, and I'll just say that.
The term, I should be talking in here, right?
These words.
Okay, yes. The term, the something pun, something pause, that's what we're responding to. Can you tell me what that is again? I want to make sure I answer the question.
Okay, so I love that question, by the way. I love all those questions, but the ethno-racial pause as a concept that I generated after reading tons and tons of specifically kind of YA BIPOC narratives that allow the protagonist of color to take pause and invite us as reader viewers to join in with that pause, breathe in moments of formation that have historically been denied BIPOC teens.
Interesting. Right. So
you, now that you've got the concept in your kind of artist toolbox, is it something that you might think a little bit more about the next time you, I mean, I use I am Alfonso Jones, but maybe there might be other ways as an artist, for you to kind of create those spaces where we are invited to breathe along with the characters who have historically not been allowed to breathe.
yeah.
And again, putting it too simply, whether you do that consciously or
Right.
intuitively.
Yeah. Wait, am I answering? Oh, am I answering this? No, this is interesting. I might want to pause and think about that, actually, before jumping in. Because definitely, I mean, my mind is racing with, I might say this and then pause, you know, still. But my mind is thinking about that, right? So so this is the thing. I was talking to somebody about this earlier about DJing. And, you know, she was asking me, so, you know, how do you think about your DJ sets? And then, how do you, and I'm like, I only spin what I want to spin, and I don't care about my audience, right? And I think that the artist, when you come to see an artist's work, you should come and see what the artist has to say. I don't take requests, right? Especially if I'm spinning vinyl. If I'm spinning vinyl and I have it, I will play it, because I'm like, I wanted to play that too, right? But I believe that, like, if you're coming, for example, you came to hear the four of us, thank you very, very much. But how many of you have gone to a movie and not enjoyed the movie because you came to see the movie that you thought you were going to see, that you wanted to see, and then it was not that, right? I didn't enjoy Nope because of that, right? And I had to back up. I was like, I got to see this movie again because it's not what I wanted, right? With that, I want to really think about the pause, because I'm also thinking about where you show Miles Morales, like when you show that the mask is torn, right? And then you see his face. And that is an opportunity for the audience to come in and enjoy Spider-Man through Miles Morales, right? But a moment like that is also how I connect to my son, who was around Miles's age when he cosplayed, right? Or when I was drawing, I said I was gonna pause, but but when I was drawing I Am Alfonso Jones, my daughter was Alfonso's age, at that exact age. But my son literally lived the life of Alfonso because he was a theater major in high school, right? Or he was a theater major in college, but he got into theater in high school. And drawing that during, like, Black Lives Matter and police brutality, there was no pause for me. There was no pause for police brutality. And I literally was naive enough to think that the book I was drawing was going to soften the heart of police officers, right? I literally thought maybe black and brown kids will stop dying and you know, police brutality would end because of this book, or at least while I was drawing this book. And of course that did not happen. And literally up to the day we went to press, if you look at the in the very back, there's a list of names of every black person that was killed, right? Literally up to the date that we went to printing. So we were updating that. Imagine that you're updating that list every day, right? I said I was gonna pause. I wanna think about that pause, but those are some of the things that come to mind in the idea of inviting the reader in. And I definitely want to give some space for my colleagues to address that, and I'll come back if there's time.
Well, I mean, honestly, Corey, I'd say I have experienced that as a mixed bag from having talked to, I've done that kind of artist studio on the stage in front of people conversation, which is nerve-wracking. I've done my very first article though, and the thing about comics, obviously there's artist-writer split. So
Right.
my very first article, I interviewed the writer of Truth, Red, White, and Black, Bob Morales, who's passed away, and he was lovely. Like, it was just he loved. He didn't agree with everything, but he loved what I wrote. He thought I got it, and I've had that experience with, you know, in other spaces. I've also had some really touchy things happen with artists in high, and I would say I do think art historians, that actually is a space where they tend to have very close relationships with artists, often because it is a field where, because of museum culture, they depend on professionals in terms of curatorial practice. So there are some art historians who do, in terms of contemporary art, sometimes have those relationships. And I often feel, because when your new book comes out, I want to bring you and I'll be like, oh, I want to have a conversation, but I don't want to say anything stupid. Like, like this was like not what, that's not what I meant, right? So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I often feel that, because we want people to explain things sometimes, or we might push towards like saying, well, this is, to say more, and artists, I often feel like, well, my work says what it says. It's there, I've done it. So I don't know, I go back and forth on it. I do think that we are in conversation with each other, because I do think cartoonists often value that we really value and want to write about your work, and we do adore you and teach your work and want people to pay for your work. So I think that is mattered, but I also think in terms of the conversations just in terms of practice about how we want to unpack, and then people are like, why don't you let my work stand? Like it's a tension sometimes. It's been my experience over the times that I've done it.
I just want to say quickly, you slipped in something crucial that I had not, which is not just the relationship between, say, the critic and the artist, or creativity and criticism, but teaching.
Mm-hmm.
Those of us in academic positions teach. I am teaching a course right now where I'm teaching the work to students of both of you, and that's a different kind of connection.
Mm-hmm.
I've done panels before where I've approached, where I've been maybe the only comics artist on the panel, and the rest of the people have been poets or academics or writers of within some other medium, or I've been on a comics panel where it's more on the sort of side of fandom, right? This may be my first time interacting with scholars of comics, and thank you for that, first of all. But I take away so much from these discussions, especially as someone who's just started to teach herself. I teach at SVA, don't know what I'm doing, I've never taught before, but just in teaching myself to be a teacher, I've learned so much. I mean, obviously I've read Understanding, MacLeod, and some of those seminal texts, but doing more research in order to try and teach my students something has made me a sort of, autodidact in the wits. Like, I've learned so much doing the research that I've brought, I'm sure I have brought back some of that to my practice. And then just hearing what you had to say about, reading, doing a close reading of Emil Ferris's book about, panel structure and how that suddenly becomes a sort of cage. The panels become a sort of like moment of structure, that imposed structure. That was like a revelation for me to hear that. And I may or may not do the same thing unwittingly in my own work, but to hear it articulated like that is a moment of sort of neural kind of connection, right? And Frederick's reading of, or positing of like pauses, ethno-racial pauses. I find myself also, people have said there are these pauses in my work, these moments of silence that may or may not be an ethno-racial pause, but like they certainly, people seem to remark on it, and that's something I have done without knowing, without putting it into words so much. I knew I needed a break within a page, or within, there might be a rant that then is followed by a pause, and that rant is made even more sort of jarring because of the pause that follows it. But that, yeah, to hear it articulated for me as a new teacher and as an artist is very powerful.
I mean, I'll say just some of your examples. Often when you were relying on the term inheritance, struck me as moments that I could connect with this concept. I was thinking, the first of our presentations, the last, I thought they come together on those points. Let me ask a question that I think is really a sort of same version of the question, but reformulated in a way. And I'll do it in a semi-playful way to get at it. And maybe this is a very utopian notion, because I recognize this, sometimes the tensions you're talking about, Rebecca, between, if a critic says, this is what you're doing in your work, and the artist says, no, that's not what I'm doing. So the fanciful little game I'll play is, imagine, I'm Professor X or someone like that, and I configure you four as a team up. We build an Avengers Tower or something, and you four are the superhero team. How would collaboration be? So I'll make it a more abstract, general question. How would collaboration between scholars and artists result in maybe new, more effective, more powerful forms of research and pedagogy and teaching? So what if, Teresa raised this question in her introductory remarks, what if like every research project had made sure an artist was part of the team? But in other words, what if artists and scholars, historians, however we define them, critics, are collaborating, and again, I'm thinking in the bubble of my academic context, but how would research look different? And again, how would teaching look different?
Or how would comics look different?
How would comics look different?
Comics look different, yeah.
Even better way to think it through.
I'll just really quickly, so a couple of things that I've been able to do at UT Austin with my Latinx Pop Lab. One is last fall I initiated what I'm calling the Latinx Collaboratory. And so I flew in Tim Fielder, a friend of ours, and brought in two local creatives, Latinx comics creatives, so black and brown together. And in the studio, all of us got together, and in 5 days we created a comic book that became the seed for an anthology comic that is coming together and going into production in December. So on the kind of fly, pulling us all together, trusting that certain levels of different experience coming together. Tim actually educating us all on how to kind of give room on a page to the drawing when we had it really cramped up. The other part of it is, if we're talking about, I see us more in the kind of X mansion, but for the School of Gifted Kids.
The beats will be dope.
Yeah.
Stark Tower.
I think that these spaces also need to be very inclusive of our K through 12, not just kids, but teachers. And I think that we role model in our collective work, not just generating and bringing attention and awareness to important issues, but also if you see it, you can be it. And a lot of kids need to see that there are scholars committing their time to this work, and there are creatives also committing their time to making this work. And I think that that's the sort of transformative space. It's not necessarily here, although we are generating knowledge, it's going to be over here.
And I just want to kind of go back to something like the idea of the critic and the creator, right? For Bishakh and I, please speak for yourself, but we are critics, right? And the fact that we are exploring like ourselves, like that research becoming me-search, or that me-search becoming research, right? It starts out of the criticism. And I mentioned this yesterday, around age 12, I noticed that, hey, the only time I showed up in the book was when I was getting beat up by my favorite superheroes, or I was the one robbing somebody or whatever, or that depiction of someone who looked like me, right? That's a critique. And then adding to that critique is the making, right? And putting yourself as the center of that story, right? And it's interesting we bring up this idea of pause, because I struggle with pausing, right? That's why the work is so detailed. I don't know when to stop. It's never done, right? And inviting other people in. I think about these things often. I don't necessarily know when or how to do that, right? And I think there's so much I'm trying to figure out that. And I talked about this over lunch. Like, I talked way too much yesterday, I think. I think that I should have showed less slides, right? Maybe like talked about a few pieces or whatever and tried a different approach. But it's interesting, even that is a critique, right? And I think that these overlaps that we might think in an academic sense are really separated are really, no, we are all critiquing, we're all making. That's how you get the literary scholarship, right? It's that critique that becomes, okay, I got to get this out of my head, right? But believe it or not, I think there's very little difference. I think it's a way of seeing. So how do you make this thing happen? Great organizers like Frederick, shouts out to Frederick and all the work he's done with SoulCon and the BIPOC initiative, all these things, like, it takes somebody who understands organization. But something like that, for me, happens in a cafe every week. You know what I'm saying? That's not, you see that happen. It's not always publicized, but I was doing that 10, 15 years ago, put it on, online. Hey, I'll be at this cafe, drawn until they kick me out. Come join me, right? It's that type of, in a way, that's kind of a pause, like, and to be able to invite people in. But that is also a critique. Like, we need this community. Well, shit, it's not existent, so I'm gonna build it. You see what I'm saying? It becomes, obviously, it becomes a lot more, organizational. You need somebody who can organize and grant fund and write proposals and things like that. But it starts as simply as I just want to be around people who are like me, who are thinking about these things. Let's just get together, right? It really starts in these very simple ways that sometimes we just forget about we did when we were little. All right, and I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Just had to laugh again, trying to writing literary critics, like, and we just have to get these ideas in our head. I wish I wrote like this.
Oh, really? see, you see, that's why I don't have my books out.
Like,
right?
it's a little slower for me. Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple things. I mean, I think there are some people like you, Frederick, and John Jennings. I mean, he's like, I mean, I used to say he was the Kevin Bacon of the comics and Black visual arts world, but now I think Kevin Bacon could be the John. He aspires to be the John Jennings of Hollywood. That John just is like the urtext that brings people together, and he did a very good job for a very long time of bringing together critics and artists, and the people who just are really good at that, and institutions, Billy Ireland. I mean, I'm biased on that front, but I do think that OSU and Billy, and now I think what you're building at Texas, is a place where that happens. I also think, and so I think that what that produces, we know that it can produce events. We know that it can produce a curation, like things like that are not traditional scholarship. It can produce, like, we know that that is happening, and that ideally we'd want multiple modalities. Like, we want exhibitions, and we want comics, and we want scholarship, and how these things can all work together. And we can have scholars who are also artists and producing comics, and so like having that combination of things. I also think that there's the teaching piece. I mean, one of the things we know, I mean, we all get really famous. It's harder to get sometimes to get you all like, to come like but when a lot of us, we're younger or hustling, and in academics, maybe we were hustling for a long time, we have more of a culture of exchange, right? So like, I would visit your class if you wanted someone to come visit class or teach whatever, like, and then, I ask, like, we have those exchanges when we're, hungry and hustling and, need those sort of exchanges. So, I mean, I think that there's kind of an energy when you're someone who's still trying to build and trying to support like the artists you love and the work you love and what's possible there. And I think that part of the key is the multiple modalities of production that are generative and not only traditional modalities of production.
I think that, part of that is also that the sort of fluid nature of what you're saying is reflected in, I don't know how much this is true in other organizations of learning, but like at SVA at least, the majority of the people who are teaching these classes are working artists, right? So in a way, we're teaching ourselves to become teachers in the process of doing the teaching, and I think that certainly brings a sort of a richer experience and attitude towards our own work. I'm wondering how much that happens in other fields, right? Like film, or like how often does a film scholar get to collaborate with a director, and what happens when that, I mean, does it end up being like a big mess, or like how often do visual artists collaborate or have sort of interchanges with art critics, right? Who are, I think that's quite a fraught relationship in a lot of examples, that you can think of, music critics and musicians, right? I think there are more examples of music critics who then end up like trying to make music, or the other way around. Not so much. I'm not sure, but it is. I think there's more of an opening for that to happen in something like comics.
Again, I mean, I'm going to leave this behind, but I do think sort of origins in both directions from fandom. Comic scholars were fans and comics creators were fans.
Yeah.
And some of the institutions of fandom, which is, again, can be a mixed bag, as we all know, but, the practice of conventions that, and something like the Eisners that, eventually opened up to allowing scholars to speak as well as, signings of comics and things like that. It does seem to me there's something about the culture of comics that has done a bit of a better job than some of the other arts. And there are, not to go into any of them, but there are examples I can think of, say just in film, where that link has worked, has failed, but on the whole I think it's still rare. It just doesn't happen often. And so that, I'm going to, I could talk to these folks all day and into the night, but I want to now open things up to you. And again, just my gentle suggestion is that I think it would be most invigorating for all of us if you have questions that kind of, sweeping questions that apply to everyone here. But please.
You're talking to the X-Men, I mean.
Yeah. Yep.
What book has a teacher given you that you think about often? Or what book do you wish, comic, that you wish teachers would incorporate into their classrooms, history or English classes?
History or English?
Or science or math, but I guess history or English is the way that I think about it, I guess. I was trying to make a different version of what's your favorite book. That's a boring question.
which I'm happy to hear responses to, but it's a question that always drives me crazy. So. Hard to choose.
The book that stands out for me that was given to me as a grad student, one of the first books I was given, was Slavery and Social Death by Lando Patterson. It's a book that I still haven't finished reading, right? It kind of, and the reason that stands out to me was because, I'm not teaching it, obviously, I'm not teaching it, but it stood out to me because when I went to grad school, I was really blessed to get like I got a very full ride. It was very awesome. But I was scared of losing that. So I was really trying to make some very happy, safe art. And my professors were just coming to see me, and they were talking to me in these studio visits. They're like, all this stuff you're talking about is not in this work that you're showing. Like, where is this anger? And I'm like, I'm not trying to get kicked out of grad school. Like I gotta send money home to my family, right? Like, I gotta set my kids up, pay for their, tuition soon, et cetera. And everybody laughed at me. And to the point I was getting pissed that I thought they were laughing at me. And they were like, you don't get it. Like, this is the safest place you can be to be as black and as angry as you want to be, and put this out of your work. Matter of fact, here's some books, right? So when my professors started buying me books, like white professors, right? They were giving me books that I thought were so radical. I was like, are you supposed to be doing this? Like, are you gonna get fired for this? Don't let anybody see. But it was books like that now I realize, I'm like, no, these are not the most radical. Nobody's getting fired or anything like that. But it was a very, it's a very dense book. It's a lot to read and absorb. But it was a very pivotal moment for me as a burgeoning academic and as a grad student to get books of this caliber, because my very radical white professors understood, like, we're going to teach you how to be black and angry, right, in a very safe space. So if that makes sense, it kind of shaped the way I thought about scholarship after that.
Can I ask, so was your question about any book, or was it about comics?
It can be any book or comics. Any book or comics. I guess I'm curious. All of your
I might have
presentations.
went in a totally different way over.
No, that's okay. All of your presentations for the last 2 days, you've all like looked back to your youth, or you've talked about youth in some way. And so that was sort of the inspiration for the question, which is like, what were the books from your youth? But that could also mean like through grad school. No, I mean, I think that we're youth. I think we can deconstruct what an adolescent is in a lot of ways, and we can say that we are still adolescent in so many ways at this age. So any book that a teacher gave to you that you think about often, or a comic you'd like to see in the classroom.
I'm just going to slip in. One of the resonances I heard across the 2 days was legacy, inheritance, those kinds of, all of you, in fact, in some ways thinking back and thinking forward.
I'm going to be a little evasive about answering the question by saying, I write about this a little bit in my memoir, Spellbound. My French teacher, who I had a huge crush on, gifted, well, she didn't gift it to me, she lent me her dissertation, her PhD dissertation, and said, here, you might be interested in this. And I'm like, no, well, I'm not sure what it was. And it was not so much the content of the dissertation itself, but the gifting that for me was a very pivotal moment. It was a sort of seduction, right, for me, which is a little dicey to say in this day and age. I actually had to, and I write about this too in the memoir. She invited me to her apartment to return this dissertation to her.
Wow.
And it was a pivotal moment for me as in confronting a kind of I don't know. I mean, I like to joke that she kind of made me, in addition to my parents, made me the woman that I am, because I always aspired to her kind of swagger, her confidence, and her sexiness. So yeah, the gifting did something for me as opposed to the book itself. I'm happy to say she also taught to some degree, made us do comics as homework during French class. So she made, there was an education in comics for me, and I'm happy to say I gifted her back a copy of Apsara Engine when it came out, and I also came out to her, and she wrote back to me, and there was a sort of closure to that cycle of gifting that was very, very powerful for me. She has consequently read Spellbound, and I think she's okay with it, but I'm not sure that I don't know. Like I say, it's thorny, so we'll see. But thank you, Madame Kumer.
I mean, it's interesting because we were talking, I mean, my teachers didn't give me books, like that wasn't, I didn't receive books as gifts. I mean, except once, which the only time a teacher gave me a book was my typing teacher in junior high, who gave me an historical romance novel, which then set me on a path of decades of romance reading. And it was it was like one with like what, Radway's readers called, forcible persuasion, sexual violent rape. It was like a rape it was inappropriate, but it made me a romance reader for life. I wouldn't recommend that one. Although it was a very important, Defiant Spitfire was what it was called. It was a very, it influenced my life, I would say. But I'm just going to approach this from a different angle, because I feel like you're also thinking about K through 12. So if there is a comic that I often recommend to people, and it's so contextual, like I said, I do give Fun Home. I suggest Fun Home for like people who feel like there's not serious, and I've been trying to push. My favorite thing is Monsters on art historians and whatever. But for teaching, and it's a complicated one, I really recommend American Born Chinese, and because it does so many things well. I think it's so smart about narrative structure. I think caricature and how to complicate it is obviously like really important to me. It's important to my heart, and I know it's complicated to teach, but I think that it's so smart about that. I think it's really interesting about identity. I think it's really interesting about the immigrant experience. I think it's really it just does so many things, and I think it teaches well. And it's one of those books where like when the students get what's going on, it's sort of like, oh, at least that's been my experience teaching that book. So that's a book I recommend to teach.
And I'm going to add, Rebecca has a wonderful essay on American Born Chinese, and if you want a copy, just ask me, I'll get it to you.
So yeah, me too. Like that wasn't even within the realm of possibility. The teachers that we had in very rural, very under-resourced school were barely surviving themselves. My biggest kind of, I guess, the people in my life that were important. One was the shop owner at the corner who had the spin rack and allowed us, me and my buddies, to sit at the base of the spin rack and read for as long as we wanted whatever was on the spin rack. So that meant, I loved Ben Grimm. I loved Professor X. These were also my literacy tools because my first language is Spanish. And when we moved from Mexico to rural California, it was rednecks and Mexicans. And when I went to school, I was told not to speak that dirty Mexican by my teachers. The public library, there was this really incredibly awesome librarian. And I, because my mom worked late and stuff, that's where I would go. And the librarian, basically curated and probably ended up, the reason why I ended up at Berkeley is because of the librarian and not my teachers. So I'm sorry, but yeah, it's not because they were mean, one was, but it's because they were like way overworked. Yeah. They were trying to figure shit out for themselves. You Brought Me the Ocean, killer. I teach that every intro to comics. And it's because it appeals to, the superhero stuff. But it's like Jewel Moreau. Oh, you saw some of that, right? And you know, so everybody relates, but they also understand the kind of the serious craftfulness of the visual, verbal kind of storytelling arts with that.
I know you weren't directing it at me, but I'm going to slip. I'm going to slip in the only comic that I regularly teach that students thank me for teaching is Linda Berry's 100 Demons. Works like a charm.
Thank you for answering. I wanted to hear about your literacy lives, which is the teacher in me, so there's no wrong way to answer that question.
So this question is mostly for Stacey and Bishakh. Like a connective thread that I noticed between both of your talks was the urbanities that you're kind of like drawing into the comic space. Like, I wanted to know what exactly urbanity meant to both of you, because I know, Stacey, yesterday when you were talking about your process in locating this radical Black aesthetic, the tenets of hip hop, one of which being graffiti, like came up, and the graffiti aesthetic is so palpable in your work. And then Bishakh, you render these like urban spaces that are sort of like dripping with belonging, if that makes sense, like a space where one becomes themselves. And I feel like when it comes to comics, the like draw towards rendering these urban spaces usually outlines or defines them with sterility or with this like dirty grime. And I noticed that both of you sort of like reject or avoid, circumvent the like associations of cities, but still understand these urban spaces to be spaces of racial becoming. So I wanted to sort of probe what exactly those spaces mean for both of you. And of course the question is open to everyone if you have more thoughts on the ways in which urban spaces are rendered.
So I'm very interested, you know, I was talking about culture and tradition, right? And of how a vibrant sort of cityscape and therefore a vibrant streetscape are sites of that kind of engendering of culture and tradition. So for example, when I pointed to that moment where I was like reimagining the vegetable market, right? That's something that's been lodged in my a very sort of South Asian memory of Kolkata from when I was growing up. But it's right there on the street, right? It's part of the cityscape, if you will, the streetscape and the kind of life of the street. And I think streets, I mean, this is true for Kolkata and it's true for places that I love, like Madrid, right? Like the street as a place of, you know, the sort of afternoon walk or something, the kind of culture of the street and the city that come alive because of the fact of that it is a city, right? And I wanted, in a lot of my drawings and the stories that take place in these the spaces of the city, that's what I'm trying to approach, is that kind of like you were saying, the sense of belonging, right? How is it enacted within the alleys and the sidewalks, the storefronts, the shop fronts, the markets that are both temporary and fixed, you know, the hawkers of wares that are come and go, the crows, the sort of refuse of the street. Like, I'm thinking of like in Calcutta, like, you know, a very, very specific moment that's loaded with culture for me is like going to buy sweet yogurt at a sweet shop, and then they come in these little like clay cups, right? And you eat, you have this like sweet yogurt, and you toss this clay cup onto the street, and it eventually becomes, it's part of the streetscape, which sounds kind of like a big mess, but it's also recycled. Like there's a process, a living, dynamic street life that sort of takes care of itself, which is something I'm trying to tap into with some of this work, you know.
That's interesting. I was thinking about, you know, how to answer this, how to think about this. I think you know, in many ways, the urban comes in because I was born and raised in Albany, New York, and I don't think there was a graffiti scene in Albany, New York, right? Not that I saw. And I always kind of, dang, I wish I grew up in New York City. I would definitely have been a graffiti artist, right? So that shows up in my work because of that influence. But I also don't draw lines between fine art and right, the hierarchies of art. This is low art and this is high art. I'm influenced by the what would be considered the high art just as much as I am the low art. So I try to bring all of that together because it's me. But I also was raised in the urban environment, you know, but also I was raised in the suburbs. You know, for a period of my life, I lived in my grandparents' home in the suburbs. It was the house that they brought when they left the city, and it really changed the trajectory of my mom's generation, right? You know, and I was influenced by that too, but also I think it's interesting because the influences that I bring into my work, I think you see, I don't know if you see it as much as I shouldn't say that. I think when you hear the music that I spin, it makes a lot more sense too, because I'm just as much like Wu-Tang as I am Kaja Gugu. You know what I mean? Like I often say, like my emotions sometimes. I'm a you know, definitely an Aries fire sign artist. You know, sometimes my emotions will go from like I said, from Wu-Tang to Sade in 5 minutes. You know what I mean? And I think that there's a transparency. I think that with that I try to put into the work. And with that, you're going to see Romare Bearden in my work, and you're going to see this influence of this graffiti in my work. But you're going to see so in New York, for example, you could easily walk down the street and you would see these posters that these street teams put up, right? An advertising event, but they don't take down the posters that were under that, right? So you would see years and years and years of posters and stickers up. Right, and you would tell this history that would go back for years, right? Because they're just posting on top, right? And there's this decay and this palimpsest of the history that was before that. I try to duplicate that culturally in my work. Now, I'm not saying you're going to look at that and see all of that influence, but it is a heavy influence to the way that I think about creating work. I also, because I'm a graphic designer, and I use Photoshop, and there's sometimes I add you mentioned grime. I actually add a layer of sepia tone that is a sepia tone paper that is really kind of grimy and beat up, right, to age the work in a particular way too. But it's a, quote, Afrofuturist piece. So it's a depiction of the future that is already dated to look like something that might have come out like that's already yellowed and old and decayed. To think about like these ideas that we're thinking about, we deem as the future, but these are really old ass ideas. You know what I mean? Like, right? So, but that all kind of comes from that way of thinking about urban and these influences that I had, but it's so much more than that too, because the influencers are not just that. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Can I add something? So this is a good, perfect example of like how concept generated from art can work its way into this space and direct our attention to things that we might not otherwise. So last week I taught Justice League, the Whedon kind of recut version or whatever, as I do every time I teach my comic book media and identities course. And it's because it gets everything so obviously wrong. and it's fundamentally like a terrible movie. But part of that discussion was, where is Cyborg in this narrative space? And where is, like, how is race here so obviously, right, placed in its street, it's urban, it's, at a certain moment, he's even like, I'm the alien, right? I'm the other. It's monstrous in ways that the students are like, yeah, and you're like, well, now let's start looking around us. It's a little less, it's more subtle, but this is so in other words, art and the willfulness on the part of the artist to recreate an urban landscape that breathes life and diversity in an organic way, and not just as backdrop for gangbangers that are of color, or to shade as, cityscape as racialized, becomes an important remediation and space of transformation. But this is what we're doing here. And now maybe some of us will go back to those narratives out there and be like, oh yeah, and then we'll also go back here and see, oh yes, this, of course.
I'll slip in a really quick comment, and it's not my original thought at all, but many people have argued that comics are, not entirely, but very largely an urban phenomenon. I mean, comics really arise with cities in many ways. Modern comics as we know them are so crucial to New York and Paris and London and elsewhere. Time for at least one more. Put the pressure on. One more great, terrific question.
Esther.
Going once? Great.
Hi. So I would like to ask about, this is something I always think in regards to arts and academy. And since we've been already talking about how you all started from fandom, how do you now relate to just like being fans of comics, right? And how your honest just pleasure of reading or thinking about comics, and how do you manage to work with that and to sort of separate it, or I don't know, with the fact that it's also part of your job and what you do. And because sometimes I do feel like when we're working in academy or when we're just creating and researching, we sort of have to sort of split it or deal with it in a different way. I don't know. I would like to know more about it.
Mm-hmm.
How do you keep up that love?
Right. Me too. I want to know what everybody else has to say.
Well, I mean, one thing I would say, which I feel like it's like a confession in comic spaces. I didn't grow up reading comics, and I feel like I should have a correction. Like, it's almost like, like teachers remind me of books. I don't think I guess teachers gave people books, but my mother bought me all the books in the world. So and the only comics she bought me though, she did buy me comics, illustrated classics. She was always trying to get me into class. It was one of the many, because I had all these subscription services like that, Enchanted World or whatever, and that was one of them. But I read newspaper, I read Bloomsbury and stuff like that, but I wasn't reading comic books. And so when I started reading comics in grad school for pleasure, but the first thing I chose to write about was this sort of blend between it's my scholarship, it's something I quite liked. And I do think the line in literary studies between fandom of authors and scholarship is often uninterrogated. I mean, those James Joyce people will take you out.
Yeah.
I just think that I just think people don't acknowledge this sometimes.
Yeah.
And so I do have I write about a lot of things that I despise. I have bad objects and good objects. And so that sometimes makes me a little different in the field. It makes me a little complicated in relation to these things. But I think that people, I've written about how I think that people need to think about different genealogies of ACA fandom, and that they, and it's not something to shy away from, but that you do have to be attentive to like what it means to do this. And like, so like I do sort of check myself sometimes about like, okay, I love this and how am I interacting with it? But it's less, I feel less tendentious. I feel less of a tension around it sometimes because I actually do write about a lot of things that I really dislike. And so that sort of keeps a balance, I think, for me, that I'm always sort of looking, even with things I quite love. I mean, every now and then I love something so much, like I was talking about I May Destroy You last night. Like, I mean, anyone tries to say anything bad about that, I almost want to take them out. But like, but I haven't written like an academic article about that, so I might change that a little bit. But I wrote like more of a general criticism, like LA Review of Books piece about that. So I think it's important to just think about the various kinds of affective attachments you have to the things you write. But I also think that in general, the Academy doesn't interrogate across disciplines how often from other scholars to other work that they have like fandom, biased relationships to, and that's just fairly consistent across disciplines.
I was talking to Anna about this last night, about my very fraught relationship with fandom. As I was mentioning, my comics literacy came from my folks who thought this is how you teach a child to read or whatever. So it was sort of outside of fandom in a way. And once I started going to cons, so we were discussing like in the aughts, right? Once I started making comics sort of semi-seriously, I was very put off, right? It was a very white, straight boys club, and I was like, wow, there's just no space for me here, right? And it's not like people excluded me from stuff, but it's just like as a psychic space was just not the space for me. And I thought, if this is what it's like, I'm going to just sit at home and do my own stuff and not participate in the culture of comics, right? So I was very put off by that. But, times have changed a lot. There's so many more people of color, so many more queer, non-binary, trans people making comics. And I'm going to hesitate to say that I found a space, like I've returned to the, space that I longed for, because that, again, doesn't exist. But yeah, there certainly is more of a space for people like me who felt very excluded by the sort of dominant culture of fandom of a certain time.
Do you want to go? Go for it.
No, all right. The way I understand your question is either the pleasure versus like the work that has to be done, right? Connecting that or separating that. It's interesting because I don't read enough comics, right? Like I'm always behind in reading comics, embarrassingly so. To the point, like I'll get to a summer and I'll probably read like 100 comics or something like that, right? It's interesting, like even reading for the sake of research is fun to me, right? It's a way of entering into that space again. Like I always feel like I gotta reconnect with comics, and that's just because I think the other work just kind of gets in the way, But I will also say that it's interesting to talk about like space, right, and finding your place in it. I feel like being able to write about comics or write about my artwork, and it connects so much to comics. It's a way for, I'm trying to find my place. I'm still trying to find my place in it. I don't think I'm in it. Like I don't look at myself as in it. I still look at myself as outside of it, trying to find my place in it. So one of the things, for example, I've been able to do recently is to do visual essays and, write about how I think about pop culture or whatever in relation to my images, for example, right? That has been kind of a way that I could find an entry point into there. But in reference to reading for scholarship versus reading for fandom, it's a very small, it's so joined. I don't look at it as really separate. Like, I think we're all kind of doing that same thing. Like, we love the problematic comics. You know, it's crazy. It's like we actually love them, and we critique them in these television shows too, right? Because that's connected. We get angry as hell at it, but we love it at the same time, right? We're just as much fans of these stories that don't include us as the people who are fans of that too. And we talked about fandom a lot this weekend. It's odd. It's a really odd, contentious relationship.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like I said, that I think we're always contending with, and that is with writing about it, drawing it, teaching it, and then, you know, still, but it comes from a place of enjoyment first, which is odd. Yeah.
Frederick, before you speak, I was going to say, this is a great question, and I often ask myself why I turn something most people do for fun into my work. But I thought when you asked, I thought this is going to be really interesting to hear everyone's responses. In Frederick's case, I thought your enthusiasm and love for comics comes through your research so palpably to me. Which is not to say that you don't criticize what needs to be criticized, but my sense is, after Frederick's presentation, one of the things I had to ask him is, as someone who I think reads a lot of comics, I said, how do you read all these comics? You know, how do you keep up with as much material as you do? And I got the sense in that of just your pure enjoyment while you're still, you know, working as a scholar.
Thanks. You just answered my no.
I don't
you.
sense
That's
the
it.
tension or
No,
divide
there's
in
in
you.
fact,
so.
in my talk, really quickly, there was that moment, and I don't expect anybody to remember the details of the talk, but the awe and that kind of emotion that we experience. And I will be honest, I mean, in my backpack right now, I have my sticky notes and my little sticky stuff that I put on the comics, and when I'm reading comics, it's exactly what Corey was describing. It's, and then, I'll have them stacked in my laundry room with all the sticky notes, and then at a certain point, I'll go and sit with them, and I'll do something like I did for you yesterday. So yeah, it's
Stealing that.
Yeah.
I really appreciate that question, and also hearing everybody's answers. But I also want to say, just over the past 2 days, I've been seeing, or we've all been getting to see, these comics that you so clearly really love and enjoy in your work, and you're ascribing value to that in a way that they don't necessarily get that kind of critical attention in other arenas. And so it's really important work, and I appreciate it. So.
Thanks so much. I mean, Stacey, your comment made me think that in a certain sense, I'm going to get vaguely psychoanalytic here, that I think we want to love every comic we read, and we get annoyed when we don't love some of them. You know, we think, why aren't you as good as I want you to be?
Right.
You know, so.
Exactly. That's great. That's great. Yeah.
Just to follow up on what Stacey said about the contentious nature of our relationship to fandom and or reading comics. There was a while before my books were published when, probably when I was, after I'd written my books, but no one was willing to touch them, that and during the writing of them, that I refused to read comics because I was envious of people who had put work out there, and I was like, I didn't want to have that influence touch my work. Like, I didn't want to read stuff and be like, oh, I should be more like this, or this is how I become successful. I just wanted to do it in a vacuum, which is not a great idea. I mean,
But it's a thing.
it's a thing, right?
Yeah. We don't talk about that enough.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's lingered to this day, where I'm like, I mean, now that I'm teaching, I obviously read a lot more comics, but for a long time it was an issue of of jealousy, and like, you know, once I get my books out there, maybe I'll go back to what it was that made me love this medium in the first place. But I thought the only way I could operate was in isolation, which is, yeah, not something I recommend to anybody who is trying to write a book, but some people just have to do it, I think, you know. It's a survival strategy in a way.
And these comments remind me, I'm sure you all know this, probably many of you do, but Rebecca, you know you're in good company, not growing up reading comics. Linda Barry very prominently did not grow up reading comics, except she talks about, and this touches on things you were talking about in your presentation, but she discovered Family Circus, ostensibly the perfect American family, and she was fascinated by it in part because it didn't resemble her family at all. And I've always found that a really fascinating sort of a figure I think of as one of our major comics artists, that she didn't have, partially has to do with her being female in America, but she didn't grow up reading comics, and then the one that she latched onto was one that she did not see herself in, but meant something to her. It was this fantasy world of what families live like that.
I feel like it just speaks to what you keep saying. I just find it's going to stick with me is this idea of returning to a home that doesn't exist,
Yeah,
and how much
yeah.
the much pleasure and our attachments are that.
Yes, the notion of the nostalgia for a place or time I've never been to or lived in is really a compelling idea.
And it's like, again, this issue of like envy, right? Like I'm jealous of people who have that, in their lives. And this is why, I was like, there's so much of my work that is approaching that, but never will touch it. It's like that Ian Curtis lyric, for those of you who are Joy Division fans, touching from a distance further all the time. It's like, that's the way I feel about like my comics work. It's always in the reaching and never touching that the comics happen. Boy, kill me now.
On that note.
Sorry.
I was going to say, I can't think of a better place to stop. So please join me thanking again our wonderful guest.